And welcome once again to The Grey Matter. It's here where we look at strange and in some cases disturbing events that have happened around the world. Some will be known to you, others maybe not. Today we'll be touching on one that is probably as disturbing as it's possible to get, as we take a look at a man who would have to rank as one of the most disgusting and depraved creatures that ever walked the earth. Even toning it down, this is a story that is both stomach-turning and nightmare-inducing. A horrific case that includes a sexual assault, murder and mutilation of women and children. So please be warned that its contents are extremely gruesome. We're about to take a look at Andrei Chikatilo, the Red Ripper of Rostov, and his 12-year-long reign of terror. At the end, we will discuss the failures of the police in their pursuit to catch him and whether we think they handled the case badly, or is it just that we're now able to look back with the benefit of hindsight. While over the years there have been several serial killers that have become household names, such as Peter Sutcliffe and Ted Bundy, there are also others that the majority of us have never even heard of, despite the heinous nature of their crimes. And this is a category that Chikatilo seems to fit into. He was a man that butchered women and children purely for the perverse sexual gratification that it brought him, and the death toll left in his wake was as staggering as the sheer brutality of his actions, crimes that he felt very little or even no remorse for. So without further ado, let's get into it. Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was born in Soviet Ukraine on October the 16th, 1936. As part of the Soviet Union, the country was under the iron fist of dictator Stalin, and these were miserable times with famine having swept through the land. Cannibalism was not unheard of, and it was even rumoured that a couple of years before Andrei's birth, his cousin had been stolen and eaten. This was a tale that held much fascination for him at the time, and just maybe was a contributing factor to what would happen in later life. When the Soviets entered World War II, Chikatilo's father Roman was conscripted into the Red Army. He saw some action but was captured by the enemy and held prisoner until the end of the war. When he returned home, instead of being treated with respect, he was regarded as something of a traitor, and not just by the state but also by his own son, who was already starting to absorb the propaganda of the Stalin regime. Andrei was a shy and awkward child, especially around girls, and found it difficult to fit in with his peers. He was a frequent bedwetter right up to the age of 12 and lived in constant fear of the other children discovering the secret. He would later state that he was a constant object of ridicule. As he grew into a young man, he became physically well built, eventually reaching nearly 6 feet in height. Yet he was still introverted and lacking in any confidence, especially around women. He chose to lose himself in books, studying Marx and Lenin, becoming a devoted communist, convinced that his future lay in politics. At 18, he had his first sexual experience, but like others that were to follow, it was far from normal and left him feeling nothing but disgust. Later, he would find himself a regular girlfriend, but once again was unable to perform sexually, only adding to his shame and frustration, and the relationship soon finished. Instead, he studied hard, determined to make it into Moscow University, and was devastated when his application was rejected, only adding more feelings of failure to his already fragile psyche. At this point, he decided to settle for a lower level place in a local communications college and continue with his studies there. After a 3-year spell in the army, where again he was not able to fit in or make friends, he quit and headed for home before crossing the border into Russia to a little town just north of Rostov. Here he found a one-room apartment and a job working as a telephone engineer, and in 1962 met his future wife Fenya. He was by now an active member of the Communist Party, a position that for those that didn't know him on a personal level, awarded him a certain amount of respect. He fervently studied Russian language and literature with the goal of obtaining a degree to better himself further, but back in the bedroom there were still the same problems, although somehow he and Fenya managed to produce 2 children towards the end of the 1960s. By this time, Chikatilo was withdrawing more and more into a fantasy world, one in which he was sexually dominant, and one that also became more and more twisted as the months passed. In 1971, he received his degree and took up a new position as a school teacher, the increase in wages allowing him and his family to move into a decent-sized apartment. The trouble was, as intelligent as he might have been, he could not control the pupils, who would mock him continuously, and his fellow teachers found him as sullen and unpleasant as everyone else who had ever worked with him over the years. And it was here that he first started fondling the children in the classroom, especially the young girls, with him even ejaculating in his trousers when one of them struggled to resist him. Asked to resign by the director, Chikatilo had little choice but to leave. However, his position would go unreported, leaving him free to apply for a position at a technical school. Once again, before long, he would be asked to resign, although this time apparently over cutbacks. In 1978, Andrei Fenya and their 2 children moved to the town of Shakhty, where the couple both found work at another technical school, which included the benefit of an on-site apartment. Once more, he would continue his abuse of the pupils without consequence. Aside from rumours being circulated, his behaviour would be practically ignored. But deciding he needed somewhere more private to molest young people, Chikatilo bought a tumble-down little shack down a quiet lane for this very purpose. It cost him next to nothing to buy and was a purchase that would be kept a secret from his family. He started off by luring young girls back there with promises of food and drink, but as soon as they were through the door, he would start demanding sexual favours from them. And then, on the 22nd of December that same year, Chikatilo would kill for the first time. The victim was a little 9-year-old girl named Lena Zakhanova, lured back there to use the toilet. Leaping on her, he became like a wild animal, pulling a knife from his pocket and driving it into her stomach, repeatedly stabbing her until finally wrapping his hands around her throat and squeezing. Not until he ejaculated did he finally come to his senses, and his thoughts immediately turned to self-preservation. He disposed of the body in a nearby river, cleaned himself up and went home, in his haste leaving the light on. In the investigation that followed, because of the close proximity of Chikatilo's shack to where the body was discovered, he found himself a suspect. Reports from a neighbour that the light had been burning all night, an unusual occurrence, quickly pointed a possible finger in his direction. As the police delved further, they found out that he had been seen taking young people into the shack, and a drop of blood was even found close by. Probes into his character found others only too willing to confirm his past lewd behaviour with children. Chikatilo was hauled in for questioning, but his wife's alibi that he had been at home all night would eventually cause them to turn their attention towards another neighbour, a 25-year-old named Alexander Kravchenko, who had previously served a sentence for a similar murder 7 years before. Now, maybe as a suspect, Kravchenko was just as likely as Chikatilo, but in their haste to nail someone, they got the wrong man. There was even a witness who had seen the little girl with somebody fitting the description of Chikatilo, but Kravchenko would be charged for the crime and executed 4 years later, still protesting his innocence. In 1981, Andrei Chikatilo was once again asked to resign from his teaching role. The investigation into Lena's murder might have exonerated him, but just his association to the case was an embarrassment. Again, his misconduct with the children was left off his record on the condition that he just went. He soon found work as a supply clerk for an engineering company, and though it might have been a step down career-wise, its flexibility opened up new opportunities while he moved around the country collecting parts. It was pretty much the perfect job for somebody with Chikatilo's murderous agenda. It had been nearly 3 years since he had killed Lena Zakhanova, but by the summer of 1981 he was ready to strike again. After talking to a 17-year-old girl at a bus stop, he managed to lure her into the woods, and here would become his killing ground for the next few years. Again the red mist descended and he was a man possessed, punching her with his fists and slashing her body with his knife. Afterwards he bit off one of her nipples and ran around her dead body in a state of ecstasy. He then covered her with leaves and walked away feeling nothing for what he had done. The following year, 7 other young people aged between 13 and 19 years of age would all meet similar fates. The murders had now intensified in cruelty, with Chikatilo stabbing his victims around the eyes and body parts being removed either by blade or teeth while they were still alive. Finally, the authorities had to admit they had a serial killer on their hands. Only to themselves, though, this was information that would not be revealed to the general public for some time yet. Throughout 1983, 7 others were to meet similar deaths from Chikatilo's collection of knives. He no longer cared if his victims were male or female, as long as if they were male, they were too young to fight back. It was the blood flow that he craved, the unimaginable pain he could inflict on them that brought him to orgasm, nothing more. The following year he would kill 15 times. Amongst them was a young woman that he had met while in Uzbekistan on his business trips. By now, murder and mutilation were as normal to him as going out with the lads would be to most men. He was rarely at home. If he wasn't on one of his work joints, he would spend the night skulking around the train station or riding the carriages looking for more prey. It was easier than you might imagine for Chikatilo to find victims, as there was always many runaway children, prostitutes, down and outs and general misfits to choose from. It would be this year that forensics would test the semen samples found on his victims' clothes. They were all the same blood group, AB, and from here onwards they would concentrate their attention only on suspects with this particular blood group. As it turned out, this was another error of judgment. In September that year, Andrei Chikatilo would be brought in for questioning. He'd been apprehended by an officer who had noticed him in the marketplace trying to pick up young women. When asked to open his briefcase, it was found to contain a length of rope and several sharp knives. Further investigations revealed that 5 years previously, Chikatilo had been questioned in regard to the first murder. At this point, they believed they had their man, but the results of the blood test came back. Group A. He was not their man. But despite this, they held on to him. There was a report that he had stolen some linoleum from work, a crime that carried jail time. It's an ironic twist that in this particular case, Chikatilo was most likely innocent. In December, after being in jail for 3 months, he finally appeared before the courts, found guilty of theft and imprisoned for a further 3. Unbelievably, for 6 months they had their man behind bars, but not for killing over 20 people, but for stealing 2 rolls of linoleum, and they had released him. Chikatilo was not only free again, he was in a better position than before. Due to the blood test anomaly, he could do whatever he wanted. He now had the perfect get-out-of-jail-free card, a different blood group to the killer, well, a different blood group to himself even, but more about that later. It would be a further 6 months until he killed again, making it a whole year if you include the time spent in prison. On the 1st of 1985, he began again, starting with the slaying of an 18-year-old girl while away on a business trip. Later that month, back in Sharkey, another one would follow. But for some reason, there would be no others that year, nor the next. In fact, it would be May 1987 before Chikatilo would commit his next murder, soon followed by 2 more. A further 3 would be added to his list in 1988, and a further 5 the following year. A police purge followed, and in the dragnet they cleared up over 1,000 previously unsolved crimes, but unfortunately their maniac was not amongst them. And then something very strange was said to have happened. A note was sent from Moscow to the public prosecutor's office in Rostov. It mentioned a recent scientific discovery in Japan that in extremely rare cases a man's semen and his blood can belong to 2 different blood groups. It was said to have been given not that much attention at the time, but again, let's look at that a little later. 1990 would see Chikatilo's death toll rise by another 8 victims, but by the end of the year his luck was beginning to run out. On November the 6th, 1990, Sergeant Igor Rybakov had been sent to patrol one of the many railway stations. It was the day before the Revolution Day holiday, miserable and damp, and just as he had been instructed, Rybakov was watching the nearby woods for suspicious behaviour. It was then that he noticed a tall man in his 50s wearing spectacles and carrying a bag. He'd come out of the trees and was walking towards the station. The policeman asked to see his papers and noted down the name in his little book before sending him on his way. The name was Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo. After his shift had finished, the sergeant left a note on his superior's desk and disappeared home for the weekend. And a week later, the contents of the note were being brought up in a conversation at the police station, and once again the name Chikatilo was being bandied about. More in-depth probing into his past revealed rumours of child molestation, as well as being the original suspect in a little girl's murder, now nearly 12 years previously. On the 20th November 1990, Andrei Chikatilo was arrested as he stood outside a cafe. He put up no resistance and remained silent as he was driven away. After many days of questioning, Chikatilo finally broke and gradually confessed to 56 killings. It was the end to a 12-year reign of death and mutilation. Over the next few weeks, he would be taken back to various crime sites where he would be made to reenact the murders in detail. Generally, he showed little remorse for his crimes and seemed to blame everything and everyone else for what he had become. On the 14th of April 1992, the Red Ripper of Rostov was taken to the courthouse to be charged with 53 counts of murder and 5 counts of molestation of minors. With his head shaved and surrounded by guards, Andrei Chikatilo entered the courtroom, where he was placed in a steel cage. Instantly there was pandemonium, screams of rage and despair from grieving parents and other family members of the victims, people surging forward for a better view. There is little doubt that without the cage they would have just ripped him to pieces. And here you can see just how afraid he looks. Just reading off the names of the victims was to take 3 whole days, and the entire case would drag on for months, with Chikatilo at times refusing to answer questions and even refuting the charges. He even went as far as dropping his trousers and waving his penis at the court. It is quite likely that, knowing he was facing the death penalty, he was either trying to prolong the case by sabotaging it or hoping to escape it entirely by appearing insane. In the end, it made very little difference to the result, as he would be judged sane. The very fact that he'd set off time and time again armed with a murder kit in his bag was evidence of all the killings being premeditated. The defence would claim that all the evidence was circumstantial. After all, not one person actually witnessed him kill. But the evidence against him was overwhelming. On the 15th of October, he was led into the courtroom for the last time. As the sentence was read out, the room erupted. He'd been found guilty on 52 of the 53 murders, all 5 molestation offences, and would face the death penalty. On the 14th of February 1944, Andrei Romanovich Chikatilo was executed by a single bullet to the head before being buried in the prison cemetery. He was 57 years of age. So there we have a brief account of a long and involved case. So now to address some of the mistakes that happened along the way. The first was the obvious one, that Chikatilo should have been on the sex offenders register from the first time he molested a student and was sacked for it. Yes, the school director may have had to put up with possible uncomfortable investigations had he reported it, but his silence allowed this man to just repeat his sexual assaults elsewhere. Now obviously the blame for this cannot be apportioned to the police inquiry that followed, but the second mistake surely must. After all, 1978 saw Chikatilo questioned by the police as a suspect in that very first murder, only to then dismiss him. It is unbelievable that a wife's alibi would be taken as the gospel truth. Without knowing the setup at home and the relationship between the couple, to just assume she was telling the truth was a ridiculous error. Although not officially denounced as a sex offender, the rumours of child abuse, plus the blood outside the shack and the light that burned all night, that should have thrown up a bigger red flag. Add to that the witness's account of a man fitting Chikatilo's description being the last person seen with the little girl. Surely they were far too quick to dismiss him. The third was not following up on the 2 murders in Uzbekistan, which had all the characteristics of those that had happened so recently in the Rostov area. Surely just cross-checking flight logs would have eventually led them to their killer. And now we have that blood test. Apparently Chikatilo was an extremely rare case in that his blood type was group A and his semen AB. Now I've been unable to find any actual confirmation that this condition has a name or even exists. I've heard it suggested that maybe he was a non-secretor, somebody who leaves no trace of blood in any of his other bodily fluids. But surely this would render the semen samples inconclusive rather than a different blood group altogether. Is it possible that this supposed condition was invented as a smokescreen to cover up a bungled blood test? A theory that I've heard put forward more than once. I'm not a medical man, so I'm unable to answer this question. In fact, I'm hoping that one of you out there can. So there we have it. If you have found this video interesting, please like, subscribe and share, and hit that bell for further notifications. And please do comment below. See you soon.